is run by a bunch of investment bankers, and Morningstar's modus operandi.
I'm Jason Stipp from Morningstar, and welcome to the Friday Five. The government is turning its attention to financial reform now that a health care reform bill has passed. About 100 amendments are being considered for this bill, and after yesterday's bizarre market activity, a few more might be added to the docket. Morningstar markets editor Jeremy Glaser has a few ideas for reforms that he'd like to add to the bill, and he's here to tell me what they are today. Jeremy, thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Jason.
So what are the 5 things that you might like to see the bill be added to the bill that aren't being considered right now?
I think we need to talk about a consumer protection agency, this idea of too big to fail, leverage in the system, derivatives, and finally we're going to talk about 2 parts of the banking system that I think really need to be separated.
Consumer protection agency, maybe a possibly contentious issue. What would you like to see specifically added on that front?
This has been certainly one of the more contentious pieces of the legislation, where Republicans seem to be pretty opposed to it, while Democrats continue to want to put a very robust consumer protection agency in that would essentially regulate a lot of the financial products that are coming out of the bank. So if you wanted to create a new type of mortgage or a new type of savings account, well, maybe savings accounts aren't that contentious, but they would have to go through some sort of regulatory review process before they could be put in front of consumers. And I think that this is a dual-edged sword. I think we certainly want to make sure that banks are providing consumers with all of the information that they need to make informed choices about their finances. So important provisions shouldn't be buried in the small print of a mortgage. You should know when it's going to reset and what it's going to reset to, what the resets have looked like in the future. Information like that that's really important to people. So should the government necessarily be deciding exactly what kind of things could be available to everyone? Probably not. But should they make sure that people have the information they need? Absolutely.
Sure. For number 2, TBTF, it's not a yogurt. It's too big to fail. It's on everyone's lips recently. Tell us a little bit about too big to fail and what these reforms really need to capture on that front.
Certainly too big to fail is one of the big issues that needs to be solved by this regulatory regime. The problem that we saw before with Lehman Brothers was that you could force a firm into bankruptcy, but then the entire capital market seized up because nobody knew where any of the money is, nobody knew where those assets were, and Lehman Brothers was counterparty to so many different transactions. So whatever this new bill does, it needs to create a system in which these firms can wipe out the equity holders, but stay operating long enough in order to wind down these trains in an orderly fashion so that the market can actually correct for this and that we can punish the people who took the untoward risk, but then also not worry about punishing everybody else because the entire system would completely collapse.
For number 3, leverage is a dirty word for a lot of people. It seemed to get some firms into trouble. What should the reforms account for on the leverage front?
Leverage is something the federal government definitely needs to be looking at. As all the investment banks have now become bank holding companies, that means their deposits are insured by the FDIC. So the federal government is back there saying the full faith and credit of the federal government is behind these deposits. So I think that means the federal government should have a say in saying, all right, this is what you need to do with these deposits. You can't lever it to these extreme measures that you were before. This can be incredibly difficult to measure. Last week, we're at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business Management Conference. We talked to Professor Steve Kaplan, who was talking about just these issues, that he thinks that capital requirements would be a good way to do this, to make sure the banks have more capital. That would keep the leverage down more than coming up with a firm number that would be there. But no matter how you actually keep this leverage in check, I think it's something that the bill needs to address, and something that if the banks are going to be insured by the government, the deposits are, we need to make sure the deposits are actually being kept safe.
Sure. Number 4, Obama was on the news recently because of the nuclear reforms that he was making. Buffett had talked about derivatives as being weapons of mass destruction. What kind of reforms need to happen with derivatives?
Derivatives can be a big issue. So there certainly are cases where derivatives serve a useful purpose. You have hedging for a lot of operating businesses that want to be able to get rid of that fuel risk or get rid of any risk that they're trying to look at. But at the same time, we saw that derivatives got people into trouble and just added a lot more kind of hidden leverage to the system and interconnected to the system that people saw before. So I think at the very least, we need to have a central clearinghouse where these derivatives trades are happening. So that way, we have a sense of how many of them are out there, who the counterparties are. So if we do get into a too big to fail situation, if we do get into another crisis, we'll know exactly where the risks are and can address them, instead of now where a lot of those are just open questions.
Sure. For number 5, I think this maybe might impact consumers perhaps most directly of all your ideas. Tell us a little bit about what you think needs to be separated in the banking system.
There have been a lot of calls to bring back Glass-Steagall, which is this idea that if you have a bank holding company, you shouldn't also be able to own other financial institutions. And this had been around since the Depression, was repealed in the 90s, and there's a lot of talk that this is what caused the financial crisis. But I think what really needs to be separated is the the pen from the desk. I think it's time to finally get rid of that little chain that makes it so difficult to write out those deposit slips. I think it's something that consumers will really find helpful and should get the rest of the banking system back on track.
I've noticed that the pens are good for etching my name into things, but not so much for writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for joining me, Jeremy.
You're welcome, Jason.
I'm Jason Stipp from Morningstar, and thanks for watching.